Good afternoon. Welcome, friends. I'm Steve Norper. I'm here with the Korea Society and here to introduce my great colleague, Nikita Desai. I did want to welcome you all. We're really delighted to see so many people turn out, especially on this month where we acknowledge the second anniversary of the release of the United Nations Commission of Inquiry report on North Korean human rights abuses. And so we have stood up two programs, one the one you'll hear today with Nikki and Sylvia, to talk about the issue of stateless children, which is really critical and under-focused on. And secondly, on February 18th, we welcome you back. If you've been at this, you're welcome back gratis for a discussion on the second anniversary of COI and where that stands in terms of United Nations action, North Korean responses, and what we in the international community can do going forward. It is a pleasure to have Nikki lead today's discussion. As some of you know, she has done really tremendous work here on the human face story of North Korea in all different aspects. That has included discussions with AP Bureau Chief, that has included a very valuable session on the Underground Railroad in North Korea, as well as a session on gender dimensions and the Commission of Inquiry report with Roberta Cohen. So this is just the latest installment in terms of her contribution and part of a larger series that we have up with about 10 sessions on North Korea and human rights. You can see that at koreasociety.org, where we also encourage you to come and join as a member if you are not already. And to find information on all of our policy and corporate programs, as well as those in education and the arts. So, Nikki, welcome. Take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for that kind introduction. Welcome all. I'm really happy to be here. Today we focus our attention on an important issue that's undercovered, the rights of children. Children born to refugees from North Korea that are stateless and invisible. And they're invisible in the very country of their birth. So today with me is Sylvia Kim. She's a human rights lawyer. She's also a senior advisor to the European Alliance for Human Rights. She's recently accepted a position as regional director for Asian Americans Advancing Justice, so congratulations. And she's also a co-founder of Han Voice, which does tremendous work in the issue of human rights advocacy. So welcome, Sylvia.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here.
Great. So let's get started. I think statelessness is an issue that not many know about. What is statelessness, and what are the figures in terms of stateless people globally? And I think you note in your research paper 20 to 30,000 North Korean stateless children in China. So tell us more.
Okay, wonderful. I hope all of you picked up a copy of the report that was outside that kind of will go into a lot more of the details. Today we're just going to kind of do more of a cursory review. But statelessness has been defined by the 1954 Convention on the Status of Stateless Persons as the lack of nationality under the operations of a state. And so I know that sounds like a lot of legalese, so I'll try to break it down for you. And in fact, the international legal community found that there were some different conceptual distinctions of different kinds of statelessness. And so actually that definition relates to something that's called de jure statelessness. And what that basically means is that there is the absence of a legal link between an individual and a state that eventually affords them a nationality, which is in a sense a membership that grants certain rights and benefits under a state. And de facto statelessness refers to a situation where an individual may have a nationality under law, but for whatever reason is unable or unwilling to exercise their rights and duties and benefits under that nationality. So actually the children that we speak of are de facto stateless, which actually makes it a little bit harder to provide them with international legal protection. A lot of the conventions and treaties relate to this de jure stateless situation where there is just an absence of this legal link. For the situation of children who are born in China and whose mothers are North Korean, they're actually de facto stateless because under Chinese nationality laws, they're supposed to have nationality. Actually, it specifically says in Article 4 that if one of the parents are of Chinese nationality, that their children should also be Chinese nationals. But unfortunately for these children, the inaccessibility to the system of nationality is what renders them stateless. And the system of nationality is implemented through something called the Hogu, The Hogu is essentially a passport-like document that has all the demographic information, who the head of the household is, their physical characteristics, and this kind of Hogu passport affords individuals in China access to different social services. So the right to education, the right to health, the right to work, the right to marry. So without this Hogu, individuals are essentially on the margins of society with no legal protections, with no access, and this is why they're literally invisible. And we actually call this report the Invisible Children because specifically even within the statelessness discourse in the international community, there is just a complete lack of mention about these children that are born of North Korean women and with Chinese fathers. And so even within this international community and this global campaign to end statelessness, the particularly plight of these particular children is that they're completely invisible and not even included in many of the statistics. UNHCR estimates that right now there's about 10 million stateless people around the world, but this does not include the millions of others who are de facto stateless. In fact, in China alone, it's considered that there's another 10 million who are de facto stateless without access to the Hogu. And of the 10 million, 20 to 30,000, it's estimated, are of North Korean descent.
So how does one try to obtain a Hoku? What are the sort of steps that you need to officially get socioeconomic, civil, educational rights granted as a child?
Of course. So I've spoken to some of the grassroots organization working directly with these children, and apparently there's 3 practical steps. First, you have to have a proof of birth, so obviously proof that you were born in China. And secondly, it was mentioned that that there needs to also be proof that the mother is repatriated to North Korea, and so that therein lies the inability to access the Hogu system. So essentially, if your mother is with you, unless you're choosing to repatriate the mother, you have an inability to access the Hogu. Another barrier is also the price. So a lot of local officials determine the price of the Hogu, and so they vary depending on which area of China you're in, and oftentimes the prices are quite exorbitant. There have been cases of bribery where, if fathers are still involved, or if there are certain individual cases that people are able to bribe officials and to accept the Hogu, especially if the mothers have already been repatriated. But for most of these children born of North Korean mothers, they're just not able to get the Hogu.
So essentially, obtaining a right of citizenship and nationality in China for a child born of Chinese North Korean marriages, they have to self-abandon from their mothers, or their mothers have to go back to North Korea. There must be some proof that they're not there in China any longer.
Exactly.
Can you talk a little bit more about the causes of this? So we've heard increasing accounts of North Korean defectors, a lot of them women, who are trafficked and smuggled into China. Can you expand a little bit more the circumstances of that?
Of course. I always say if you want to understand kind of the situation in China, of course, it's important to go back to the root cause, and that's important to recognize the plight of North Korean people within the regime. North Korea is a totalitarian state. It's been ruled by a single-family dictatorship since the Second World War. People have known of atrocities and human rights violations that have been taking place there for decades. But it really wasn't until the United Nations Commission of Inquiry report released 2 years ago, where the amount of evidence and the methodology in gathering this evidence, it became very undeniable that the atrocities being committed by the regime amounts to crimes against humanity and are so atrocious that you begin to really understand why so many people are trying to escape North Korea. This also came about more clearly in the 90s after the famine, where there was clear shortages of food, where people started really crossing the border to China. So that's, just kind of understanding the broader context of why people are leaving. There's also a gendered impact to some of these violations that perhaps just have not been researched enough, but it indicates that a large percentage of the people that are actually crossing the border are women, whether they're the sole caregiver or have the need to survive and to feed their children. So they say that approximately, some reports claim that about 70% of the refugees crossing are actually women. And once they enter China, there's a particular vulnerability, of course. Women are trafficked. There's a lack of women in rural China. And there's apparently a demand for North Korean women because they're perceived to be more attractive. And then, of course, there's this larger repatriation refoulement issue that continues to hang over the heads of refugees, where women may be threatened. If you don't go into this forced marriage, or you don't become a concubine, or you don't become a prostitute, we're going to report you to the officials and repatriate you to North Korea.
Hmm. How do these marriages actually take place? Are they, legal marriages? I mean, in these cases, if they're trafficked or they're sold as brides to a lot of the Chinese rural who are not able to find brides themselves, they're forced marriages. But are they legal on the books? I mean, in order to recognize that, you'd have to recognize a North Korean citizen to be in China.
Actually, you're right. They're not legally recognized, and this kind of dates back to a mutual cooperation agreement between China and North Korea, where this repatriation refoulement policy kind of supersedes a lot of the other international obligations that China has, and so it's an official policy of China to not recognize North Koreans who enter their state, to recognize them as economic migrants, and to have the sole purpose of repatriating them back to North Korea.
Hmm.
And so a lot of these marriages, as I said, are not legal, not legally recognized, and these women are often forced into these situations or facing repatriation.
Hmm. So, because of the China refoulement policy and the difficult issue with North Korea, the fact that it's isolated, that we cannot actively engage, and we have to move China to engage, and are there any international frameworks, I mean, to address the rights of a child? Are there any precursors that can be looked into to help the children that are in fact stateless, the 20 to 30,000 in China?
Well, there is an international framework. I don't know if there's any precedents per se, but I always say international law has developed quite a bit, and there are several treaties out there. I mean, there's the 1954 Convention, there's a 1961 Convention, there's the Convention on the Rights of the Child, there's the Convention on the Protection for Women. There's a lot of international legal framework. I think of particular note is the fact that China is a signatory to the Refugee Convention, which particularly states that refoulement should not occur in situations where people are in danger of persecution, torture, or death. And so, that's a particularly blatant contravention to that convention. But there are definitely conventions. Now, enforcement of those conventions are, of course, perhaps another discussion altogether. But China is a signatory to the Refugee Convention, to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which do protect a child's right to nationality. So there are some international legal mechanisms which could be used to put some external pressure.
Hmm. So February marks the 2-year anniversary of the United Nations Commission of Inquiry report. We, I want to talk a little bit about what that can mean to this issue, and also, is there a way what are some policy recommendations to advance forward the rights of child and protecting them in China, and also the women and children that are refugees and are forcibly repatriated and in danger in China.
Of course. So yes, the 2-year anniversary is coming up. And as I mentioned, the Commission of Inquiry report was so monumental just because of the fact that the evidence that's in that 400-page report just is undeniable. It just undeniably points to crimes against humanity being committed. And the evidence that was gathered was done in such a way that there's a certain level of credibility now with a lot of these testimonies that were gathered. So I think the report, a lot of people have said, it's absolutely groundbreaking. And there was some momentum after the release of the report. For example, the United Nations Security Council discussed North Korea for the first time ever with regards to its human rights record. And it's been twice now that the Security Council has discussed the human rights record. There's also been the UN Rights Office that's been opened in Seoul with the sole purpose of monitoring the human rights situation in North Korea. So I think those are all positive advances since the release of the report. Unfortunately, I feel that the international community has not done enough. And that actually goes to my policy recommendation, which is that the number one issue for me is raising visibility. I think that having studied amongst other international legal advocates, there's just a general lack of awareness about the North Korean human rights issue. And although the report brings a lot more credibility and brings a lot more documentation to the issue, generally people just don't really know or understand that, listen, it's 2016 and there's still concentration camps somewhere in the world today. And so I think that lack of visibility means that for the issue of the children and for kind of more of these different specific issues, there's an extra layer of invisibility. And so I think for me, a recommendation would be to try and be a part of the international dialogue. The UNHCR actually has launched a global campaign to end statelessness. And they've released a bunch of reports. They're doing a lot of research. Not a single one of these reports mention this situation of these children in
Wow.
China. In fact, China is mentioned just in passing. And I don't know if this is because of the de facto stateless situation or what it is, but we need to be part of that conversation.
Absolutely.
If there's a global campaign to end statelessness, it just seems that this issue needs to be a part of that. So that's just one example of the need to raise visibility.
Mhm.
The other recommendation I would have, of course, is to find alliances. When it comes to this particular issue, I found that it's not quite as divisive as other issues related to North Korea. There are alliances and advocates for women's rights, advocates for children's rights. There are different UN agencies that are all working together, and I think that alliances need to be made with different UN bodies and different states. And finally, of course, is supporting organizations such as the European Alliance for Human Rights in North Korea or Crossing Borders, which we're about to hear. And so those are organizations that kind of do some of the direct work and that can be supported.
Mhm. Okay, great. Well, with that lead in, at this time, I'd like to thank our online audiences watching and live streaming, and thank Sylvia Kim. Would you please join me in giving a warm round of applause for her?